Can you walk sleep now? I'm staying put. Listen close, partner. The last woman was sold for silver dollars until a broken-down stranger suddenly ripped her away from that dark frontier fate. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a dull, hollow thud that echoed sharply against the fake wooden storefronts of Red Willow. Silver dollars. The exact price of 3 cheap bottles of frontier whiskey, or one half-starved Apache woman standing there with a leg rotting clean through from nasty infection. Old Silas Rusk counted those coins twice, his calloused fingers trembling badly, before he finally shoved them across that rough pine board. All around them, ruthless men just laughed at her, at him, and that miserable pioneer purchase. A crippled drunk buying completely damaged goods. The town's 2 biggest mistakes officially sold right to each other. Silas never looked at her face. He just couldn't do it. He grabbed the thick rope binding her wrists and hobbled toward his horse, dragging his ruined leg and leaving a deep trail in the western dust. That sure wasn't a rescue. It was more like 2 desperate folks drowning in the same raging river, clinging tightly to each other right before hitting rock bottom. Red Willow, Colorado Territory. October 1876. The morning wind carried the harsh scent of alkali dust, horse sweat, and that sweet, sour stench of cheap whiskey still oozing right out of Silas Rusk's pores. He sat heavy on an overturned crate out front of McDoran's general store, watching the Red Willow crowd gather round the auction block. He had that blank, hollow stare of a frontier man who hadn't expected much from life in 3 hard years. His left leg throbbed fiercely. It always burned when foul weather rolled in, and those iron-gray clouds piling high over the Rockies meant autumn's first real bitter chill was finally coming. That leg got utterly shredded by Confederate shrapnel at Kennesaw Mountain in 1864. Doc Harlan stitched it up, probably blind drunk, or maybe he just didn't care at all. Most likely both. Ever since that bloody day, Silas kept himself standing through pure stubborn rage and cheap whiskey. Strictly in that order. Lot 17. Stick with me here. The auctioneer, a rail-thin fella named Judd Pike with a gray beard stained dark from tobacco juice, pointed at the wooden stage. Apache girl, maybe 20 years old, captured during the Red River War, passed around several old owners. None of them could make her work right. But hell, she's still breathing, which is more than you can say from most out here. Cruel laughter rippled through the dirty miners, cowboys, and townsfolk. Silas narrowed his weary eyes at the figure on the platform. She wasn't really standing, just barely leaning her frail weight against the wooden post. Her dark, tangled hair fell in heavy clumps over a weathered face, colored just like beaten old saddle leather. She wore a cheap calico dress, likely a mission handout, torn at the shoulder and caked solid with dried prairie mud at the bottom hem. But it was that left foot that grabbed his attention. Even from 30 feet away, Silas could see the angry swelling and those furious red streaks crawling right up her ankle. Blood poisoning. She had maybe 1 week left, 2 tops, if she proved tough as rawhide. I hear 3. Judd Pike spat a dark brown stream right off the edge of the stage. Come on, boys, she's a working woman. She ain't gonna work much with that foot rotting off, some drunk yelled out. More ruthless laughter echoed. The woman's eyes were half shut, her breathing terribly short and faint. Fever, Silas figured. Bad fever. He should have just walked away. He only had $7 to his name, owed 12 elsewhere, and a brutal winter was coming fast. The smart cowboy move was buying bullets, maybe a side of bacon, and locking down his shack until the spring thaw. But then he heard his own voice, completely hoarse from pure disuse. The rugged crowd went dead silent for a heartbeat, then just erupted. Whistles, cruel mockery, filthy shouts. Somebody smacked his back so hard he nearly toppled over. Well, I'll be absolutely damned, Judd Pike said, grinning wide with those rotting brown teeth. Looks like Silas Rusk found himself a bride, boys. Maybe the old cripple ain't as dead as we all figured. For $5, I bet he is dead, one guy muttered. Dead from the waist down, that's for sure. Otherwise, why buy something that can't even run away? Silas completely ignored every single one of them. He'd learned to tune out most anything out here. He counted his very last coins and shoved them right into Judd Pike's greedy hand. Then he limped up those 3 wooden steps. Up close, the girl looked much worse. The terrible fever kept her shaking violently, despite the blistering heat. Her cracked lips were bleeding right at the dry corners. That foot. Lord Almighty, that foot was going to kill her dead if he didn't do something before nightfall. Silas sliced the thick ropes off her wrists using his heavy belt knife. She fluttered her eyes open for just a second, locking onto his worn face with a hard, unreadable look that he couldn't quite figure out. It wasn't gratitude or fear. It was pure calculation, like she was sizing him up for a pine coffin. "Can you walk?" he asked. She never answered. Maybe she didn't speak English, or maybe you and I both know trust is rare out here. Now picture this. Silas grabbed her arm, hot as campfire coals, and half-dragged, half-carried her down those wooden stairs. His ruined leg screamed in pain. Behind them, that gritty frontier auction rolled right on to Lot 18, a tough pair of mules. His horse, a bony buckskin gelding named Buck, waited, hitched all lopsided against that dusty hitching post. Silas eyed the sick woman, looked at his saddle, then back at her. There was just no earthly way she could sit up straight. He could not hold her up the whole way either. Not for 8 miles home. "Sorry," he muttered. Then he hoisted her right over Buck's withers, laying her face down like a heavy burlap sack of grain. She didn't make a peep or fight, which rattled his nerves far worse than if she had hollered. Silas climbed into the saddle, every single move a painful bargain with his ruined leg, and turned Buck toward home. Behind his back, that rough town of Red Willow just faded away, swallowed entirely by dust and distance. The grueling ride took 3 long hours. The woman hung completely limp across the horse's neck, shivering every now and then from those vicious fever chills. Twice along the trail, Silas thought she stopped breathing entirely. Twice he leaned close to check, finding a faint but steady pulse. What in the hell was he even doing? He knew he couldn't save her. He couldn't even save himself. He was a 42-year-old man, broken inside and out, living in a cramped 2-room shack, drowning his nights in cheap whiskey, trying to quiet those awful screams that kept splitting his pounding head. He had absolutely no right to shoulder another human life, but he had already raised his voice at that auction. He had already counted out the coins, so now she was his heavy burden, just like his bum leg, just like those dark nightmares, just like everything else he could not fix. The sun hung low and blood-red when they finally reached his land. A low cabin made of poorly chopped pine logs sealed up with thick mud, tucked into a hollow between 2 small hills. In a leaning wooden shed stood Buck and an old dairy cow. A sagging chicken coop leaned hard against the east wall, while behind it, all the Rocky Mountains rose against the sky like jagged, broken teeth. Old Silas Rusk half-carried, half-dragged that poor woman inside the cabin and laid her on the floorboards right near the cold iron stove. She lay completely still with her eyes shut tight, taking quick, shallow breaths. He struck a match for the lamp, built a fire, and boiled water. Then he knelt down beside her and studied that foot. Up close, it was worse. Much worse. Let me tell you, her ankle was double its size, stained deep purple. That nasty infection had already crawled halfway up her calf. When Silas touched the hot skin, she woke up instantly with a sharp gasp. "I have to clean this," he said. She just stared hard. Silas repeated it much slower, using his calloused hands to explain, feeling like a total fool. She fired back in Apache, short and razor-sharp syllables. Didn't sound friendly at all. Right. Well, he grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the shelf, his very last one, God help him, along with a mostly clean rag. "This is going to hurt like hell, but if I don't do it, you will be dead by Sunday." He didn't wait for permission, pinning her ankle down, yanking that cork out with his teeth and pouring the liquor. The raw whiskey hit infected flesh, and she shot up from the floor, screaming with a terrible sound, just like a wild animal dying in a trap. She tried to break free, but Silas held tight and kept pouring, watching the savage wound foam and bubble. She fought back with strength she shouldn't have possessed, cursing in Apache, in English, and maybe even Spanish. When the glass bottle ran dry, he let go. She scrambled backward until she slammed against the cabin wall, her chest heaving wildly, her dark eyes completely wide and frantic. "It's done," Silas said in a low, quiet voice. He felt downright sick, his hands shaking. "That part is over now." He found a thick blanket and tossed it. She snatched it with one hand, never breaking eye contact, looking at him like she expected an attack. Silas just retreated to his dark corner, pulled off his dusty riding boots, and collapsed heavily onto his rope bed. His bad leg burned, his tired head hammered, and he just wasted his last drop of whiskey on a wild woman who surely wanted him dead. He closed his weary eyes and waited for the bad nightmares, and they surely came. The bitter smoke, the screaming, Gray Boy desperately clutching his torn open belly. When he finally woke, he found her staring from the wooden table. Her hand was tightly closed around a broken piece of jagged pottery, sharp edge facing out. He almost laughed out loud. Almost. Instead, he just rolled over and stared blankly at the rough roof beams until the sun came up. 3 long days passed by. The sick woman's fever finally broke on that second night. Silas woke up and saw her drinking from the water bucket, her eyes perfectly clear and flint hard. He expected a thank you, or at least some tiny sign of recognition. You see, all he got was dead silence and a glare that could freeze solid whiskey. That was fine. He wasn't much of a talker anyway. On the 4th morning, he woke and found her completely gone. Pure panic struck him first. Had she died out there or just run away? Well, he heard a ruckus out in the shed. Metal scraping wood groaning, the clear sound of box stomping and snorting. Silas hobbled out and found her standing right beside that horse, hands working over his bridle with dead serious focus. No, she wasn't fixing it, just dismantling it. "Hey!" he yelled, moving faster than his bum leg wanted. He tripped over a rock and nearly ate dirt. "What in the blazes are you doing?" She shot him a quick look, sizing him up from hat to boots, then went right back to unfastening those leather straps off the headstall. Her fingers moved like lightning, loosening up those buckles, pulling straps and separating every piece. That expensive steel bit with copper rollers, bought in Denver for $4 whole, lay in the dirt like trash. "That cost me." Silas's voice cracked with pure anger. "You can't just do that!" "It's good tack. Got any idea what?" She cut him off with a sharp burst of Apache, jabbing a finger at the horse's mouth and then at the bit on the ground. Her tone was harsh, even downright scornful. The horse, though, stood perfectly calm, ears relaxed. He wasn't fighting her hands the way he sometimes fought against Silas's rough grip. Then she held up one finger, vanished into the shed, and came back holding some old rope Silas had saved for mending the fence. He just watched her anger boiling up inside his chest like steam in a kettle. She gave that rope a good look, testing its strength by pulling hard on both ends. Satisfied, she tied a simple loop at one end. Then she stepped toward the horse's head, moving easy, still favoring that bad foot of hers, even though it was healing. And she slipped that loop right around the animal's lower jaw, sitting just behind the spot where that bit used to rest. Her hands moved faster than tying a very specific, complicated knot, double turns crossing over and looping right back on themselves. He had never seen anything like it. That rope seemed to flow through Sora Flint's fingers like running water. "That ain't gonna work," Silas told her, his voice bone dry. "A horse needs a solid bit. Otherwise." She did not pay him a lick of attention. With one smooth motion, she swung right up onto Bach. No saddle, no stirrups, no mounting block. She just grabbed a handful of mane, gave a little spring, and settled onto that horse's bare back like she was absolutely born to sit there. Now, you and I have seen plenty of cowboys, but her way of riding was completely different. It wasn't some stiff cavalry posture, but something purely natural, like woman and horse were breathing together. Then she barely shifted her right hand, just the lightest brush of her fingers against that rope. Bach spun to the left so awful fast that Silas had to take a step back. Another tiny shift, nearly impossible to spot, made the gelding back up exactly 4 neat steps. She leaned her body forward just a hair and gave the gentlest squeeze with her calves. Buck picked up a butter-smooth trot. Silas just stood there, frozen mouth hanging half open, watching his own horse trace a perfect figure 8 around the yard. It all looked ridiculously easy. That makeshift hackamore was nothing but a loop and a knot, yet the horse answered to the slightest touch. He carried his head loose, stepping lightly and calmly. Sora guided that bronc one-handed. Her left hand just rested on her thigh, calm as a Sunday morning. Her balance was dead perfect. With practically invisible cues, she steered the horse through increasingly tricky maneuvers, tight circles, sliding stops, completely straight rollbacks, and even some fancy side passing Silas never dreamed was possible. The animal's ears stayed pricked forward. He was totally relaxed. He wasn't fighting her at all. He was listening, truly working with her. Finally, Sora brought Bach to a halt right in front of Silas and slid off just as easy as she got on. She pointed at that rope bridle. Then she pointed at Silas's right shoulder, the one that always ended up completely wrecked whenever he had to pull hard on the bit to force the horse to turn. Next, she mimicked a rider steering one-handed, keeping her right arm totally free while making a motion like she was holding something, free to carry a Winchester. Silas understood it immediately. Free to fire a shot. Free to swing a lasso. Free to do absolutely anything except fight a losing battle against his own horse. He looked closely at that rope bridle. Then he looked at Sora and looked back at the rope. You see, all that anger he felt minutes ago vanished entirely, replaced by an uncomfortable curiosity and a deep respect he didn't want to admit. "Show me again," he said in a low voice. "The knot." Something shifted for just a split second in Sora's dark eyes. It wasn't exactly a smile, but it was mighty close. A faint softness washed over her expression, like she quietly approved of what she just heard. She showed him that knot 3 times slowly. Picture this. It took a while, but Silas's clumsy fingers finally tracked every step, the loop, the turn, that double twist, tying it down secure. Whenever he messed up, she would guide his hands with her own. Her touch was all business, distant as a winter horizon, yet mighty patient. When Silas finally nailed the knot just right, Sora gave one single nod. Then she reached down and scooped up that pricey bit from the dirt. She walked over to the fence and hung it on a rusted nail with a fierce determination, making it mighty clear it would never touch Buck's mouth again. Silas just stood there, watching that heavy metal gleam in the morning sun. Looked like money tossed in the trash. But thinking on it, maybe not. Just imagining he wouldn't wreck his shoulder fighting that bronc anymore made the ache ease up. "Fair enough," he finally said. "We will do this your way." She never spoke a word, but Silas noticed her shoulders relax just a fraction before she turned and headed right back toward the cabin. By the end of week 2, the two had found a steady rhythm. Sora still did not speak English, or maybe she simply chose not to. Still between hand signals, sharp gestures, and low grunts, they cobbled together their own way of communicating. Silas pointed at something. She answered with a quick nod. Sora acted out a camp chore, and he tried his best to copy her. It was a clumsy, maddening system, but somehow it worked. Her busted ankle kept right on healing, slow and steady. She could walk without a limp now, though she still favored that foot whenever she thought Silas was not paying any attention. The angry red heat of the infection faded to pink, then clean white. The sickness vanished entirely, leaving only fresh scars that pulled tight against her skin whenever she flexed that foot. Meanwhile, the camp's food supply was running dangerously thin. Ever since late summer, Silas had been scraping by on dry beans and the occasional unlucky rabbit. He was a dead shot, but brass cartridges cost hard money he lacked, and he flat-out refused to waste lead on anything smaller than a full-grown buck. The trouble was, the deer had nearly vanished from the high country once the bitter winter hit. The smart ones had already headed down to the valley. The few left behind drifted through the timber like ghosts. Before you could even level a rifle, they faded right back into the brush. He was down to 3 rounds and half a sack of beans when he woke one cold morning to find Sora gone again. This time he felt no fear, just waited. He nursed a bitter cup of chicory coffee, quietly watching the tree line. She finally wandered back around high noon. She moved through the scrub oaks, smooth as wood smoke drifting through the branches. Thick, dark mud coated both her hands and her forearms clear up to the elbows. She brought a strong scent of wild sage, clean and sharp enough to clear the air entirely. Her hair was tied back with a scrap of cloth. She wore that dead-focused expression Silas was finally starting to recognize. It was the exact look she wore whenever she was solving a tough problem. Without uttering a single word, she started sorting through straight branches from the woodpile, bending each one to test its raw strength and giving flexibility. Some she kept, while others she tossed into the brush. Then she walked down to the creek bed and started gathering up stones. Listen, not just any rocks. She hunted down only the ones with the exact size, heft, and perfect shape she truly needed. Finally, Sora Flint grabbed a short length of leftover rope that Silas Rusk had been saving to patch up. Some gear, along with a few strips of rawhide left over from mending the pack saddles. She spent the entire afternoon building something on the edge of the clearing, right where the open dirt met the heavy brush. Silas watched her from the cabin door with his coffee mug in hand. Curious, despite himself, trying to figure out what in blazes she was putting together out there. The first trap looked like a tiny gallows, or maybe the timber frame of an abandoned mine shaft. Sora arranged 3 sticks in a mighty tricky pattern. 2 upright and 1 across, like that horizontal piece, was floating there by pure, stubborn magic. Then she carefully set a flat rock right on top, about the size of a large dinner plate, and weighing a solid 15 pounds. It all looked so fragile, a strong breeze might bring it crashing down. The second trap was a fair bit simpler, though just as strange to Silas's eyes. Sora stripped long, tough fibers right off a wild yucca plant. He never even knew you could do that. With those fibers, she braided up a thin but incredibly tough cord. Next, she tied a slip knot and staked it low across what looked like a narrow game trail, a barely visible path pressed into the grass where rabbits were bound to pass through at first light and late dusk. The loop hung about 6 inches off the dirt, nearly invisible, unless you and I knew exactly where to look. When she finished, she caught Silas's eye and made one simple sign. Wait. He nodded. Waiting was something he surely knew. By next morning, before sunrise, Sora checked those wilderness traps. Silas heard her moving outside, quiet as a frontier ghost, and he hoisted himself up to peer out that window. Now a good deadfall trap kills clean. Her stone crushed a fat squirrel's skull perfectly, leaving the meat and pelt completely unspoiled. She reset that mechanism with quick, dead-on precision, tweaking the wooden trigger stick just a tiny hair of an inch. The snare held a massive jackrabbit, already choked stone dead, its hind legs already stiffening. Sora hauled the game back, immediately skinning and dressing the meat on that outdoor table. Silas watched her fast, steady hands. Not one wasted motion. She worked just like his own mother did before the war. Back when stretching a single chicken across 3 days wasn't some virtue, but pure survival. It was just a natural chore of staying alive, common as hauling water or chopping wood. The squirrel pelt peeled off whole, turned inside out like a sock. Sora scraped it clean of fat and stray meat scraps. Then she stretched that hide tight on a drying frame. She took more careful time with the jackrabbit, saved the tough hind leg sinews, and sorted the soft belly fur right apart from the rougher hair. That evening, they ate meat. Real frontier meat. Spit roasted over an open fire until hot fat hit the coals and hissed. That rich cabin aroma made old Silas's mouth water like a spring creek. Sora had rubbed that hair down with wild sage and rugged herbs he couldn't even name. Somehow it tasted better than anything he remembered ever eating. It tasted rich. It tasted deep. It tasted downright real. Silas hadn't tasted a hearty meal like this in months, maybe years. Not since before he started drinking his dinner instead of eating it. He brewed up coffee. Real strong coffee, not that cheap chicory swill he usually drank. He poured her a cup, the good mug, without any cracks or chipped edges. Sora took it without a word, but she drank. She sat opposite him, eating game and sipping coffee. Let me tell you, for the first time since Red Willow, that cabin stopped feeling like a dead man's tomb. It wasn't much, but it was something. Like maybe they were finally stopping being two strangers merely surviving under one roof and starting to look like genuine partners. A week later, Sora had strung up a deadly network of snares and deadfalls spanning a quarter-mile radius right around their homestead cabin. Silas accidentally stumbled upon her clever trapping setups while inspecting the boundary fence. She'd set them with true wilderness precision. Every single one sat perfectly over a game trail or tucked right near a burrow entrance. She ran her trap lines twice a day, dawn and dusk, moving through that thick brush like she was born of the woods. Now they ate wild hare 3 times a week, plenty of squirrel, and once, even a sneaky raccoon caught raiding the chicken coop, ending up crushed under one of her heavy stones. Sora taught him how to butcher it right, cutting out the scent glands that ruin good meat if you ain't careful. Meanwhile, Silas's shoulders finally stopped aching from wrestling Bach. He could ride one-handed now, smooth and easy. Exactly the wild horse way she had patiently taught him. That left his right hand completely free to rest his rifle square across his lap. Free to point. Free to just rest. Instead of spending every ride wrestling that tough gelding into sheer submission. That Apache bridle worked like absolute frontier magic. The faintest pressure got a lightning-fast response. You and I know, ammo ain't cheap. He hadn't fired a single shot. So Silas started saving the cash he would usually blow on spare bullets. He started plotting out real winter provisions. Maybe a warm new coat. Maybe proper coffee beans instead of the cheap dirt. Maybe he could barter some of those fine pelts Sora was stacking up for flour and sugar in Red Willow. He began thinking about maybes instead of certain doom. Maybe he'd actually survive the bitter winter. Maybe they'd survive it together. The first heavy snowfall hit come late November. 3 solid days of wet, heavy flakes that turned the whole frontier blinding white and dead quiet. On the second freezing morning, Silas woke up and found the woman totally gone. This time she was truly gone. No tracks leading away from the cabin whatsoever. His immediate thought was she had finally bolted for good. His second thought, he was a damn fool for ever believing she'd stay. He stood out in the doorway, staring across that vast white expanse. Nothing moved at all. The world looked completely erased, stripped down to snow, gunmetal skies, and the bony fingers of naked cottonwoods. Even her hidden traps were buried. Bach and the cow stood huddled tight inside the shed, their breath rising in thick steam clouds through the frosty air. But listen. Sora hadn't taken a thing. Her few meager belongings, those moccasins, the spare dress, and the hunting knife Silas had gifted her, they all sat perfectly untouched in her corner. That should have settled his nerves, but it tied his gut in a knot. Maybe she wandered out into the blinding snow and just kept right on walking, choosing the clean, quiet death of a hard freeze over another miserable day, cooped up with a crippled drunk who couldn't even manage his own survival. Silas spent the whole day nursing a dark, bitter mood, burning up too much firewood, and rationing out dry beans he didn't even have the stomach to eat. He checked the few traps he could reach through the heavy snowdrifts. Came up dead empty. Every critter had burrowed deep underground. You and I know animals are way smarter than men when it comes to surviving a brutal winter. That was when a heavy truth hit Silas Rusk, biting harder than the frost. He had grown used to having her around, to the comforting sound of somebody else moving around the cabin, listening to her breathe, to the way she'd hum a soft tune while working the tough leather, and the strange rhythm of her footsteps as she favored that bad left ankle. Now his cabin felt entirely too quiet, too damn empty. It felt like the hollow ache left after a leg gets sawed off, missing something vital and alive. By mid-afternoon, Silas had fully convinced himself that Sora Flint was already dead and gone. Come nightfall, he started hitting the cooking whiskey. That cheap, throat-burning liquor he only kept around for when the physical agony got to be too much to bear. That night the cold hit with absolute malice, the kind of freeze that hunts down every single crack in the walls and every gap in the dried mud chinking. A cold that straight up kills a man. The iron stove glowed cherry red, but its heat barely reached the dark corners. Thick ice began creeping along the inside of the window panes, sketching delicate little patterns like frozen ferns. Right around 10 o'clock, his ruined leg locked up entirely on him. The muscles clamped down in a spasm so fierce that Silas gasped out loud and spat a bitter curse. He tried working it loose, digging his thumbs deep into that twisted flesh, but it felt like massaging solid rock. The winter cold had dug into his old wound and claimed it. Finally, he just gave up. He lay there with the pain chewing right down to his bones, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering if this was how it all ended. Frozen in his own bed, completely alone, without a soul around to miss him. Now, right around midnight, he heard something out in the yard. At first, he figured it was just the wind, or a heavy pine branch snapping under the snow. But then it came again. A clear, deliberate noise. Muffled footsteps, but mighty steady ones. Silas grabbed his Winchester and hobbled over to the heavy door, throwing his weight on the good leg, while the useless one just dragged helplessly behind him. His rough hands shook as he lifted the iron latch. Could be some starving, dangerous drifter. Or maybe something far worse. He hauled the door open. He saw nothing in the dark, just swirling snow, and the massive, dead silence of the wilderness. Then that sound crept a little closer, and a shadowy figure emerged from the white chaos, looking like the fierce blizzard itself had just birthed her. Sora Flint stepped out of the howling storm like a ghost. Her frozen hair hung down in stiff, icy clumps. Her lips were a dark blue, her face as pale as an old, sun-bleached bone. She swayed gently, like just standing upright was costing her every last drop of strength. But her eyes were still awake and fierce, and she held something tightly wrapped in cloth. Sweet Mother of God! Silas grabbed her by the shoulder and hauled her inside, slamming the heavy wooden door shut against the vicious wind. Heavy chunks of snow fell off her. Where in the hell? She didn't say a word, just stumbled over to the iron stove and collapsed right beside it, clutching that bundle tight. Her entire body shook with violent shivers. Silas could hear her teeth rattling. "You're half frozen to death," he barked, using his gruff anger to mask the massive wave of relief flooding his chest. "What were you thinking?" Sora unwrapped the little bundle with clumsy, frostbitten fingers. Sitting right inside were several thick, dark brown roots, all twisted up like an old man's arthritic hands. They gave off a pungent, almost bitter smell that cut straight through the heavy wood smoke. She held one up to show him. Then she made a digging motion with her freezing hands. Now Silas recognized it from old trapper tales and half-drunk conversations he'd overheard in those rowdy Denver saloons. Osha root. The old bear root. A rare medicine plant that only grew high in the jagged peaks in spots so remote only the truly desperate or the dying ever dared to climb. Sora had scaled that treacherous ridge in a blinding blizzard to fetch that root for him. The sheer truth of it hit his chest like a mule kick. She could have died. Hell, she should have died. Up there it had to be 20 below zero, maybe even worse. Think about it. One bad step, one slipping hand on slick ice, and she'd just be another frozen corpse for the spring thaw to uncover months down the line. Sora knelt down right beside the blazing stove, still twitching hard from the deep chill, and slowly pulled out Silas's hunting knife. She began scraping one of those tough roots over a tin plate, carving off fine, potent shavings. Pull up a chair. She stirred that root with a heavy spoonful of jarred bacon grease. The smell grew fierce and harsh, a medicinal punch like camphor and raw pine sap, though, honestly, it wasn't altogether unpleasant to breathe. It cleared his nose fast and made his eyes water. Then Sora turned, pointing right at his ruined leg. "It is fine," Silas lied without even thinking twice. She shot him a glare that made it crystal clear she knew exactly how awful it was, and that he was a stubborn fool for faking it. It was the exact same look his mama used on his daddy when he claimed he wasn't tired after working 18 brutal hours. A look that said, "I see you. I know you stopped lying to us both." Sora grabbed the rough fabric of Silas's trousers. He just let her roll it up. He let her look at that twisted mess of jagged scars, the old shrapnel marks crisscrossing his weary muscle like frozen lightning bolts. The exact spot where Doc Harlan had just given up stitching together whatever remained to form a downright pitiful excuse for a leg. That deadened muscle that barely worked anymore, catching cramping and aching deep down in the bone every single day of his hard life. Sora never looked away, never once showed disgust. She simply grabbed the osha root mixture, still warm from the iron stove, and started rubbing it onto the damaged tissue with firm, steady, deep strokes. The sudden heat hit him instantly. It wasn't a burn. It was something much deeper. It felt like a true warmth was birthing straight from his marrow, spreading outward through the flesh, reaching buried places that Silas Rusk had felt so bitterly cold for so long. He had completely forgotten they could ever be warmed. The tightened muscles began to loosen, slowly, stubbornly, like river ice finally cracking apart when the spring thaw arrives. The brutal spasm surrendered. The screaming pain slowly dropped down to a quiet whisper. Sora Flint worked in total silence, her hands moving with a tough certainty learned from a harsh frontier life. She found every single knot, every hard spot, and gradually coaxed that battered flesh back into something resembling a normal human leg. Her own hands were still raw red from the cold edges of her nails blue, but she didn't stop until every inch of scar was covered. When she finished, she wiped her fingers on a rag. Then she sliced another piece of root about the size of a thumb and handed it over. "Chew," she ordered in English. It was the first word she had spoken to him. Stunned, Silas just took the chunk and bit down. The taste was god-awful. Bitter, sharp, and invasive, like chewing on pure medicine mixed with a shot of cheap turpentine. He almost spit it out, but listen to this. Within seconds, a wave of heat filled his chest, rushing down his arms and legs like liquid fire. His shivering stopped. That bone-deep chill he had been carrying inside him ever since the bloody battle at Kennesaw Mountain. Since that cursed day, the whole world exploded and took his leg right along with it. Finally backed off, if only a little. Sora watched him with a completely unreadable expression. Then she spoke again much slower, in careful, broken English. "You sleep now. I stay." It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a raw truth. A promise. Silas nodded. He didn't trust his voice. He didn't trust what might break loose if he tried to express gratitude, relief, or any other wild emotion he simply had no words for. Sora settled down right beside the warm stove, wrapping a heavy blanket around her shoulders. Through the frosted window, Silas watched the snow keep falling, drifting high against the rough cabin walls. By morning, they'd be buried to the eaves, snowbound and isolated. Just the two of them, the cold, and whatever was growing between them. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something real. Something that truly mattered. Silas laid back in the bed while the deep heat of that osha root kept spreading through his ruined leg. For the first time in 3 long years. Since before the war. Before the whole world shattered. He felt the dark nightmares retreating. Felt himself slipping into a true, deep sleep, one without the screaming, without the blood, without the gray boy crying for his mama. Outside, the winter howled. Inside, for one night, there was peace. That brutal winter choked the land for 2 straight months. They barely saw another living soul. Snow drifted way past the windows. Silas and that quiet woman, whose name he still didn't know and who still fiercely refused to share it, settled into a daily rhythm that didn't feel like mere survival anymore. It was something else. A bond Silas simply had no word for. She checked the trap lines, finding game even under the deep powder. He kept the fire roaring, mended the tack, and tended the livestock. Come evening, they sat on opposite sides of the hot stove. They didn't speak much, But friend, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. He felt safe, not alone. That old war wound still ached, but Sora taught him to use that mountain route whenever the pain reared its ugly head. Her ankle healed completely, leaving just a faint web of scars. Both of them were healing honestly. Then March rolled in, bringing the muddy spring thaw. Let me tell you, thaw always brings trouble. Silas heard those horses first, 3 riders picking their way carefully up that slick, muddy trail. He spotted the lead horse right away, belonged to Amos Vile, the slick land agent from Red Willow. The other 2 were Sheriff Cole and Deputy Reed. Silas's gut tied in a knot. Nothing good ever comes from 3 grim men riding together on official business. Rusk Amos Vile barked, stepping off his saddle with a heavy leather folder tucked under his arm. Need a word. Say it from there, Silas shot back. He stood square in the cabin doorway, his rifle not exactly aiming at their chests, but sure as hell not pointing at the dirt either. Easy now, Silas. Sheriff Cole grunted, a heavy-set lawman throwing up his hands to keep the peace. Let's stay civilized. We just came for your back taxes. I paid those in November. You paid last year's? Amos sneered. Vile pulled papers from his folder. These are for this year, plus late fees. That makes $8.48. He might as well have said 4,000. Don't have it, Silas stated flatly. Well then, we'll just have to... Amos started, but choked on his words when Sora stepped into the doorway beside Silas. She stared those 3 men down for one long, hard minute, then quietly slipped back inside. That the Apache woman you bought said Deputy Reed, a young punk with a patchy mustache wearing a mocking grin. I heard all about that. You better shut your mouth right now, Silas Rusk growled low and steady. That smirk vanished from the deputy's pale face instantly. Sora Flint stepped right back out of that cabin, holding a small, weathered leather pouch in her hand, one that Silas had never laid eyes on before. She brushed right past him, crossed the wooden porch, and stopped dead 5 feet from Amos Vile. She tipped that pouch over her palm. Pure gold dust tumbled out, catching the weak spring sunlight. Had to be 2 solid ounces. Maybe even a little more. Where did you get? Silas started asking, but she flat out ignored him. She faced Amos Vile. Is this enough? She asked in English. Amos stared at her. Sheriff Cole and Deputy Reed stood there, mouths hanging open. Yes, indeed, ma'am. Amos Vile finally managed to stammer. That is more than plenty. Sora poured the gold back in the bag and handed it over. Amos took it, looking like it might bite him. We square now? Silas asked. You're completely square, Sheriff Cole confirmed, already turning his big horse around. Let's ride out, boys. Let's pause here together. They rode off, looking back twice, acting like they still could not believe what the hell just happened. Silas waited until they faded from sight completely. Then he turned to her. Where did you find that? Creek bed, Sora said, pointing downriver. Found it. Kept it. Since when? Since the snow melted. I look every single day. She held his gaze steady. This is home. I protect my home. Something deep inside Silas's rugged chest cracked wide open. Not hurting, but exactly like thick river ice finally giving way to the spring sun. Sora Flint, she stated suddenly. Excuse me? My name, Sora Flint. Then she pointed a finger right at him. You are Silas. Silas Rusk, he managed to whisper. She nodded once, like that settled some heavy frontier treaty. Then she spun on her heel and headed back inside, leaving him standing, dumbfounded, in the spring mud. A fierce late storm rolled in that night. Wasn't snow just freezing rain and sleet mercilessly hammering against the cabin roof without pause? Silas sat by the table, working a tough scrap of hide he'd been softening for weeks. Sora sat right across from him, mending a tear in her dress with tiny, incredibly neat stitches. Outside, the wind howled and rattled the shutters. Inside, the iron stove pumped out steady heat. The old coffee pot bubbled away. Silas finally finished what he was tinkering with, a pair of sturdy deerskin moccasins, fully lined with soft rabbit fur. He'd noticed her old ones wearing mighty thin, so he'd quietly sized up her footprints out by the snare line one morning. He gently slid them across the table between them. Sora stared at them. Then she looked right at him, picked them up, turned them over in her calloused hands, and inspected the stitching. "Mighty fine work," she finally said. "Try them on." Perfect fit. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She set it on the table. Silas slowly unwrapped the mysterious item. It was his trusty hunting knife, tucked snug into a brand new sheath she'd fashioned from leftover leather scraps. The sheath bore a simple, burned-in geometric pattern. He knew right then, it wasn't just decoration. Those were sacred Apache symbols, maybe meant for protection, maybe just for luck. "Mighty fine work," Silas echoed back. The corner of Sora's mouth twitched up, almost forming a genuine smile. Outside, the savage storm kept fighting. Inside, they sat in a comfortable silence, drinking hot coffee and listening as the wind desperately tried and failed to bite through the cabin walls they'd fortified together. "You and I both know the frontier ain't a fairy tale." There was no big romantic confession here, no fancy music or pretty little words. I reckon they were just two busted-up souls who figured out how to match jagged edges without drawing blood. Two tough survivors who learned the hard way that the strongest ropes ain't always braided from wild passion, but from pure, stubborn grit to weather another bitter winter, another howling storm, another rough day. Together, spring finally broke through proper come the very end of April. Those cottonwoods sprouted pale green leaves, standing out sharp against the dark timber. Sweetgrass pushed up across the open meadow, right where Sora ran her trapline.